Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Geospatial Africa podcast. I am Benson.
And I'm Okoyemi. Welcome to the first episode of the year and the new season 2. Thank you for an amazing 2021 and for listening, referring us to your network, and giving feedback. Your support has been invaluable. It promises to be an exciting year at Geospatial Africa podcast as we expand our guest list, identifying and celebrating trendsetters in the industry, as well as exploring emerging trends in the geospatial industry. We hope you will join us for the ride, as we will definitely appreciate your support. Today's episode promises to be very informative as we try to discuss some of the emerging trends and buzzwords to look out for in 2022 in the geospatial industry.
Yeah, and this episode we're going to be talking about stuff like geospatial AI, LiDAR, miniaturization of technologies or sensors, if you might like. But before we start, we would like to thank everyone who filled out the feedback form that we published on the last episode. We appreciate it, and we're going to incorporate your feedback and make the podcast better. In the meantime, if you haven't filled out the form, we're going to put that link on the show notes so that you can also help us fill out the feedback form. So let's dive in. So last year saw us geospatial people using Google Earth Engine, Blender GIS, and 3D visualization. I mean, people did a lot of projects around these topics and these concepts. We saw a lot of cartography as well. Last year was also when we had the 30 days mapping challenge, and I mean, we saw a lot of maps that were made, and that was really, really amazing. So these things that people use to build these different maps were really trending, and lately there are newer concepts that we had to look forward to in 2022 and moving forward. We're also hearing a lot of people talking about the metaverse.
Yeah, and mostly we expect that most of these trends, especially with Blender GIS, 3D visualization, both spatial and temporal, there's so many maps and visualizations that geospatial data is taking on, and they are usually due to all these emerging technologies that have become very freely accessible. And with everybody talking about AI and geospatial AI and even the metaverse, maybe we even look forward to having maybe some conferences in the metaverse in 2022, although that's a far stretch. But it's something that I'm really excited about. And I feel, yes, it's coming to realization very soon. Ini, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I listened to a podcast about the metaverse. I mean, people are talking about the fact that some people that are, pushing the idea to sometimes do not even know what the whole thing's about. But I think it's just, unfolding for us here. And I think there's also just special component to this technology as well. And we're just looking forward to see how it turns out to be.
Yeah, exactly. In 2022 turns out to be the year that metaverse really takes center stage, and of course GIS and geospatial will not take a backseat to that, very, very certainly.
Absolutely not.
A lot of changes in the geospatial industry is definitely driven by development and innovation in technological space itself. So in this episode, we'd like to introduce our listeners to some of different developments in the industry and some buzzwords, some that we're really not as familiar with, but we expect an increase in their usage and adoption in 2022 and beyond. And one such buzzword or technology is the miniaturization of technologies or sensors. This concept, the capacity to create small and often inexpensive devices and sensors with wireless connectivity is driving an explosion of the Internet of Things. A lot of us probably have heard about IoT, but we don't really know what it is. So basically, Internet of Things refers to a system of interrelated, internet connected objects that are able to collect and transfer data over a wireless network without human intervention. And I know that definition just brings to mind AI and the metaverse. And basically, that's what the metaverse is built on, Alexa and all those, smart technologies that currently taking over the developed world. So, miniaturized and lower cost sensors lead to an increase in what, when, where, and how much data is collected, and more importantly, the ability to optimize the sensor to the specific data collected.
Yeah, so I always like to tell people that Geospatial is, very much intertwined with technology, right? It grows as technology grows. So you see, when, technology grows to the point where devices or sensors are made smaller, you start to see more efficiency, things being easier to carry around, right? So, for example, we now have portable satellites and also the arrival of LiDAR, very much, accessible. And I don't know if you've heard about mapping backpacks. They're really, really, small. They're like backpacks you can put on your back, and then you have LiDAR equipment mounted on it. It's just a little high above the head, and then it can sense, the environment in 3D. Think about LiDAR, right? When you talk about LiDAR, we're talking about aircraft or drone flying around and capturing. But here we are talking about a backpack, right? Something you can just fix behind your back and you walk around and capture these things. And I think this is really, really interesting. As technology evolves, so does the, application of these tools also. And the usage is now even expanded, right? So you're not just trying to get a drone or an aircraft to fly. You can now have portable and small equipments that can be carried around from one place to another. And, everyone loves these small devices, right?
Yeah, and I think that's small but mighty. When you're talking about small things that do a lot,
Yeah,
small but mighty, like when the age of the mega computers of the 60s, and see what we use as computers now, our phone can do a lot more than what those can do.
yeah.
And that's the power of technology becoming smaller. When it becomes smaller, there's so much you can do with it, and it becomes really more powerful. And that's really the point, really.
Yeah, and that also reduces the the cost of logistics in data capturing. I mean, because you can literally carry your devices and use it to capture data. So this is also really, really good, and we're looking forward to how these things keep getting smaller and smaller, and so you see how to better use them. So I think the next thing you want to talk about is just special AI, Wayme, isn't it?
Yeah, sure. Geospatial AI or Geo AI, normally artificial intelligence has the ability to think and learn. That's what AI is. So, using intelligent algorithms, data classification, and smart predictive analysis, AI has its utility in a large number of sectors. A more specific subset of AI that combines the preciseness of GIS with razor sharp analysis and solution based approach of AI is termed geospatial AI or simply geo AI. And this concept is, like I said, it's really going to get buzzworthy in 2022. What with this, with talking, everybody talking about AI, and Ini, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I keep saying that it's really, really interesting. These things, although they're not like super, super new, but being able to incorporate this technology, these buzzwords, this concept into the geospatial space is one of the interesting things that anyone in the geospatial industry would be excited to to talk about. And I think when AI is also incorporated with geospatial and also combined with the power of GIS, it produces a sharp analytics and a very easy solution based, approach to solving geographic problems. Right. I mean, for example, now we're talking about big data, right? We're talking about people churning out a lot of data. And how do you analyze this data? I mean, you can sit down as a human to try to process this data, but think about using AI, right, to try and train the model to understand what to look out for in this data to find patterns. And I think using this with just special data is mind blowing. It's amazing. And I've seen people done research on this area. I think there's a lot of potential to look forward to this, and I think it's really really interesting. You would see it being used in things like maximum likelihood classification, or maybe the random forest algorithm that is used for land use land cover classification, right? You train the samples and then it uses that to now classify all the other places that it didn't big samples for. So it kind of like knows what to make out of it. So that's AI in the simplest sense. And I think when you go beyond this, you see bigger application of this technology, and it's really powerful when, like I said, when it's used with GIS. So maybe can you think about any other use cases? I mean, when you talked about geospatial and an AI.
Yeah, totally agree with what you're saying, Ini. I mean, sometimes I've wondered, like, how does Google Maps do it? How do they update traffic information, in real time? Like, and it's really basically AI and GIS or GPS, and it's the way that they've optimized your spatial data by using AI, to modify and get real time feedback on these locations. So it makes our life way more easier. And that's like one of the cool things about integrating AI into everything. Some people are against integrating AI into everything, but then integrating AI basically makes our lives easier. And companies like Google, they understand that to the T, and they use it to make things easier for everybody. And that's what AI really is. AI GIS provides optimization for much of these things that GIS is already used for. Due to an abundance of available data in recent times from both orbital and in situ remote sensing instruments to publicly collected data sets from governments and institutions, with the UNGGIM emphasizing increased availability of national geospatial data sets, most companies and most parastatals and institutions are trying to make as much geospatial data possible to the outside world, publicly, so that, this data can be used in developmental processes and activities. It's now become necessary to integrate AI into all this geospatial data to optimize its processing and to optimize decision ready data from them. It's one thing to have the data, and it's another thing to be able to process it maximally. Integrating AI into GIS definitely offers this sort of efficiency, optimization of the processes of analyzing the data and extracting usable information from them. We hope to see more of GIS integration and AI integration into GIS, into geospatial data and analysis, remote sensing, and all that. And also, I always say one thing that, people who use and establish GIS systems must be knowledgeable in this day and age, in 2022 and beyond, must be knowledgeable in data science, machine learning, as well as their geography. That all comes together in 2022 and beyond. That's really what we're looking forward to. Gone are the days when a GIS analyst is just a cartographer or he just visualizes maps and data. Now we have to be able to analyze optimally, analyze with speed, in real time, and that's what AI does with GIS.
Yeah, and I remember you talked about making data publicly available, right? I mean, like that's like open data, and I think I can remember that there are companies, they're using AI to extract building footprints, and they actually want to add this building footprint to OpenStreetMap because they're, one way or the other, benefiting from OpenStreetMap data. So they're using, this AI technology to extract building footprint from high resolution imagery and now add this data back to OpenStreetMap so that people can use it, and the companies as well can also use them. So, like you said, this is just one way of using AI for good. That's technology for good. So that's a great thing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, definitely. And OpenStreetMaps, like you said, and open source data, especially building footprints in areas of the world, in parts of the world like ours, in parts of Africa where most governments are trying to optimize their geospatial processes, especially in identifying building footprints and spatial distribution of buildings. And with identifying buildings, you're also identifying populations, your settlements, and the peculiarities of this settlement,
Yeah, true.
and basically towards sustainable urbanization and planning. That most governments, especially even in Nigeria here, most governments are really putting a lot of effort into optimizing their building management, building footprints, managing them so that they can understand what the population is like and what settlement is like. That's a trend that we're hoping to see more of in 2022. And I think it's a testament to the fact that most of these governments are already seeing the power of GIS and geospatial technology, and that's really commendable.
Ooh, wow, this is really really interesting. I mean, I really want to to be a part of this actually, to the growth. And I mean, you mentioned something about being a conventional analyst. We're moving forward from that, and that's still really important. Don't get me wrong, but we're also moving forward to times where we have to use more of our technological skills to answer geographic questions, and we shouldn't be left behind. We should take on this technology and move forward with it. So about that, let's talk about LiDAR now. That one can't be missed, right? LiDAR, light detection and ranging. It's a really popular remote sensing method for capturing and measuring distance from an object. Now, this method of, object detection and measurement is kind of replacing the conventional method of mapping, capturing data. And like I mentioned previously, there is the mapping backpacks that are really really portable now that people can use to capture point cloud data, which can be converted to 3D models or DEM of the object. And I think this is really really interesting. And having the skill of how to process this kind of data is also really relevant. So if this is something you're interested in, 2022 might be the time for you to start, digging your hands into this, or putting your head in and trying to learn these, technologies. Not so new, but they are getting bigger and bigger and better. So you might want to also jump in that, trend to understand how and what you can use them for. So, Opemi, off the top of your head, is there any application of LiDAR that you have seen or you've read about that is being used to in the geospatial industry?
Yeah, I think LiDAR really it's a really big deal, And apart from the geospatial industry, LiDAR has a lot of use cases everywhere. I mean, in every sector. And just listen a bit more, and you'll see what one of the reasons for that I think. But also, LiDAR plays a huge role in disaster management. I, for one, am an advocate for disaster, risk management. We've seen cases where LiDAR is used to capture ground visualization data, which helps to identify the solutions to areas affected by sudden disasters.
Mm.
Like we know, it uses laser to send pulses, then records the feedback from those. LiDAR is also used to capture building information. So after a disaster, imagine that certain buildings are destroyed. So analysts use LiDAR technology to identify buildings that are damaged and to what extent these buildings are damaged. This sort of research has been optimized using, LiDAR. Before LiDAR, it was, a whole different process. And, LiDAR has offered a newer and faster method, to get this done. So when it comes to accuracy, LiDAR is an ideal choice. And I think, Ini, you have an idea of something like this even here in Nigeria.
Yeah, actually, that's true. Where I'm working, we are actually mapping the states that the company is. So, what you're doing is, have a map of the whole state as an imagery of the state, and the LiDAR is also captured for the whole extent. And I think it's really interesting because I'm going to have to be working with this data, and I can't actually wait to, get my hands on it and see what I can do with it. And I think it's also going to be a learning process for me of how to process this data and how to interpret and make the most out of it. I can't just wait to talk to my colleagues about how we can harness the power of this LiDAR data and see what we can make of it. And we never know what could come out of it. Right.
That sounds interesting, and the fact that we have something so advanced here in Nigeria.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's, in fact, I'm almost jealous, really.
Yeah, don't worry. I'm gonna share the details with you. Okay? Don't get too.
Of course. Yeah, I can't wait.
Yeah.
Yeah, and fun fact. This LiDAR is also in our regular iPhone. It's more with us on the large scale than we even know.
Mm.
LiDAR is something that's new and exciting. And some people might just think it's just in technical work, it's all in just GIS and disaster management. But it's actually with us like every day.
Yeah.
So, example, if you're an iPhone user, the iPhone 12 family that launched in 2020, I think. The iPhone actually has a LiDAR, device for depth sensing.
Mm.
A lot of people, my sister included, is always talking about the efficiency, of the iPhone camera and its depth sensing. Only recently did I realize that depth sensing that is very unique to the iPhone family is actually supported by LiDAR. It's actually the LiDAR device in that phone. So if you look at your, iPhone 12 and even iPhone 13 and even the iPhone Pro that launched since 2020, you see a tiny spot, a black dot beside the three or two cameras, and that's actually the LiDAR device. It's the one that enables the depth sensing, that gives an almost 3D sharp focus to just random cameras that you take with the phone. I mean, this function, even some professional cameras don't even have it, and the iPhone has
Yeah,
it. So I
that's
guess
true.
that justifies the price of the iPhone and its popularity. And it's just innovation at another level. And so you see, LiDAR is with us even more than we know.
Yeah, this almost sounds like publicity for Apple. Yeah, no, we are not affiliated in any way.
Yeah, we're not. We're not. In fact, I don't use an iPhone. It's just while researching for this episode, I just came across that and I felt, oh, I want most of our listeners that already don't know that. I know some of you already know. But then some, like me, I didn't even know about this. And it sounded very interesting to me because I saw like that as this very new concept,
Yeah,
very expensive and very like not very accessible to us in this part of the world. So imagine my excitement when I saw that iPhones even have like that. That's fun to me. That's really cool. Yeah.
yeah. I think it's really interesting because I mean we're just talking about miniaturization, right, of devices, and this is a mobile device with LiDAR functionality. And I bet some of the just special folks who have known about this because I've seen article about this. I think they've started exploring, how they can use this to, create some 3D models of stuff. And I think it's nice because it still goes towards, they were talking about, making smart devices that can do amazing things. And I think this is actually really, really interesting. So thank you, Opemi, for sharing that. I definitely have learned something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we were talking about remote sensing and stuff. I think we shouldn't miss this one. I think a lot of folks in the geospatial industry were excited when Landsat 9 was finally launched. I think I've heard it being said that it was actually launched way ahead of schedule, and I think that is really, really nice. It has basically the same design as the predecessor, Landsat 8, but there are some more functionalities, there's some more enhancements, right? So, pay me, what are these enhancements from Landsat 9?
Yeah, there's so much buzz about the new capabilities of Landsat 9 over Landsat 8. And in spite of the similarities, in the design and features, and rightly so, Landsat 9 will transmit data with higher radiomatic resolution, which will allow for detection of more subtle changes, especially over darker areas like water or dense forests. Now, most of us that are familiar with remote sensing already know about radiomatic resolution. And then Landsat 9, although it's similar to Landsat 8, it's been said that it will have or it has a higher radiomatic resolution such that subtle changes over the landscape can be measured, better with Landsat 9. For comparison, Landsat 9 differentiates more than 16,000 shades of a given wavelength color, while in Landsat 7 only detects 256 shades. Imagine that. Just imagine that.
Yeah, wow. All right, cool. So that means there's going to be more better classification results, right? And I think a lot of folks who use Google Earth Engine would be also interested in this because it's going to help your models, predict better, right? And I think that's really interesting. So one other interesting thing is that the Landsat 9 images, sample images were released last year in November, and they were just amazing. I saw a sample of them, and it's just like a teaser, like this is what to expect, and I think it was really interesting. So these first images were just a glimpse of how the images are going to look like and how we can now use them. I actually did download some of them and explored, some of the features. I think it was really nice. So we're going to add a link to the show notes so you can also look at them if you haven't seen them already. And I think they're really, really good. We're looking forward to getting them.
Yeah, we're definitely looking forward to using more of Landsat 9 satellite images, and hopefully it will be made available on USGS Earth Explorer, like Landsat, all the other Landsat data is found on. And so yeah, it's really exciting. I think the sample image was of the Indian Ocean coast along Australia, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
And obviously you could see some of the subtle changes, some of subtle differences that you could detect using Landsat 9 over Landsat 8 and 7.
yeah, true.
So yes, I find that it's very interesting, and we'll be seeing more of the use cases for this in 2022. That's definitely something to look forward to.
Yeah, I agree. All right. So on the final note, all of these things you've said, all the technologies, all of the innovations affect the special industry, and we want to highlight some of the key ways they affect the industry, as highlighted by the NGAC. That's the National Geospatial Advisory Committee. So one of the ways they say that this is affecting geospatial industry is through data collection and generation. Now we talked about LiDAR, all right, how LiDAR has evolved and has revolutionized how data is being collected. I mean, people are now moving towards using LiDAR for data collection. So this basically includes collecting and processing spatial and spatial temporal data, and it introduces new data types and have a significant implication for data delivery and use.
So another point that I would like to take from the report, by the NGAC, is that emerging technologies that could affect geospatial industry would also have to do with data analytics. So basically, everything we've talked about, AI and Geo AI, and the report also highlights that the emerging technologies include human guided and autonomous machine learning systems.
Yeah, true. Because like we did mention previously, it's a lot of data being collected now. So you need a better way to analyze this data, and that brings us to the next subject, which is the infrastructure. Now you also need a better infrastructure to now support data collection, processing, storage, and sharing. So we're talking about cloud storage, which is like the next big thing, which has been the big thing. So we need a better infrastructure to store these data being collected because they're so huge. There's an episode we had that talked about data cubes, which are also a nice way of storing huge collection of data, and this is the way that this new technology is also affecting us in the geospatial industry.
Yeah, so another thing to look at is
Yeah,
access. The relatively recent diffusion of technology and data has been facilitated by involvement in access, access to all this information being wireless, being through internet use, how we access geospatial data and all this big data has been online. These changes affect who has access to new technologies and data, and how we interact with these improved tools, and how we protect sensitive information. So all these things have to be optimized and also looked better into. So we want to ensure that everybody has access to the improved data sets, but also that there's security for
yeah,
sensitive
yeah,
data, and also that the improved tools can be reached by everybody, can be accessed by everybody, although we know that some countries are more involved with development, while some are not. But how to ensure that every country has access to it, every individual or everybody that needs this data and these tools have access to it. So that's also one aspect that we need to look more into even in 2022 with the advancements in data, big data, and AI. These are concepts, these are other issues that we also need to pay close attention to as geospatial experts and as decision makers.
Yeah, and finally, this one touches on every single individual, and I think this reminds me. Just talking about these different ways that innovations affect your special industry takes me back to when you're defining the concept of GIS, right? You're talking about data, methodology. You're talking about software, hardware, and if you think about all these things you've listed, they almost cover this area. But another important aspect, component of GIS is the people. All right, so this takes us to the subject of workforce. Now, changes in technological landscape requires that people know how to use these technologies, right? So that means that people have to be aware of the critical spatial thinking and technology skills that the next generation of spatial analysts will need. Also this also requires that we are able to diversify our geospatial workforce. So that rests now on us as individual geospatial analysts, expert researchers, and decision makers to be able to adopt and train ourselves in these new technologies, so that we are we're also relevant in the future that is coming, and also push the boundaries, because we are the innovators. We are the ones that are going to take these technologies and apply it into the geospatial area and make it better. And I think this is a call to action for every young person, every geospatial analyst out there, geospatial expert, engineer, to embrace this if you haven't, and if it's something you're really interested in, you might want to push it further to see how the future turns out to be. So in this case, we all take part in being creating a future that we want to be a part of.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode. I hope you've had as amazing a time as I have bringing this to you. If you did, remember to subscribe on any platform you get your podcast from, so you get notified every time a new episode drops. Also, we'd love to hear from you. So if you have any comments, requests, or suggestions, shoot us an email at gspatially@gmail.com or reach out to us on Twitter at Geospatially. We are also on LinkedIn as Geospatially Africa Podcast. So we look forward to hearing from you. Bye.